There is a God who taught humanity everything it was never supposed to know. Writing, magic, astronomy, the measurement of time, the secrets of the underworld, the language of animals, the power to resurrect the dead. His name was Thoth, and he was worshipped in Egypt for over 3,000 years as the keeper of all hidden knowledge, the divine scribe who stood between the gods and humanity, translating what heaven knew into what the earth could receive. He is depicted with the head of an ibis, or sometimes a baboon. He carries a reed stylus and a scroll. He records everything. He forgets nothing. And in the Egyptian tradition, every sacred text ever written was ultimately attributed to him, because writing itself was his invention, his gift, his transgression against the boundary between what was meant for gods and what was meant for men. Now, in the Book of Enoch, the ancient Jewish apocalyptic text we covered in a previous documentary, an angel named Azazel descends to earth and teaches humanity metallurgy, weapons, and the arts of deception. Other watchers teach astronomy, divination, and forbidden magic. The knowledge they transmit is explicitly framed as something humanity was never supposed to receive, stolen from heaven, delivered to earth, with catastrophic consequences. Same story, different tradition, different name. Or is it the same name? Tonight we're going to follow one of the most documented and genuinely surprising threads in the entire history of ancient religion. The connection between Egypt's god of forbidden knowledge and the tradition of fallen divine teachers that runs through the Book of Enoch, the Hebrew Bible, and all the way into early Christianity. And we're going to end somewhere that almost nobody who tells this story ever goes, with an ancient Jewish writer who looked at these two traditions and concluded flatly that Thoth and Moses were the same person. Before we can make any comparisons, we need to understand what Thoth actually was in his own tradition. Not the New Age version, not the Hollywood version, but what the ancient Egyptians themselves believed about him, documented across 3,000 years of texts. Thoth was one of the oldest Egyptian deities. His worship is attested from the earliest dynastic period, roughly 3100 BCE, and continued without interruption through the Greek and Roman periods. His primary cult center was a city called Hermopolis, meaning City of Hermes, the name the Greeks gave him when they arrived in Egypt and recognized something familiar in him. The city's Egyptian name was Khemenu, meaning the Eight, referencing a primordial group of 8 gods associated with the creation of the world, among whom Thoth held a central organizing role. He was the god of the moon, not because the moon was his only domain, but because the moon was the great measurer of time, and Thoth was the measurer of all things. He invented the calendar. He counted the days. He recorded the passage of years. Every scribe in Egypt worked under his patronage, and every text produced in every temple library across 3,000 years was, in some sense, attributed to him. His role in the Egyptian cosmic order was essentially that of divine record keeper and mediator. When the gods needed a message carried, Thoth delivered it. When a dispute arose between divine powers, and in Egyptian mythology, disputes arose constantly, Thoth arbitrated. He counseled. He recorded the verdict. He was called in various texts the heart and tongue of Ra, the mind and the voice of the supreme solar creator, translating divine thought into articulated, structured reality. And most significantly for our story tonight, he was the keeper of what Egyptian texts call the Akashic knowledge, the secret records of heaven. Every sacred mystery, every hidden formula, every divine name and its power, every astronomical calculation and its prophetic meaning, all of it was kept in Thoth's library, in scrolls that only he could read. The question of what happened when that knowledge reached human hands, that is the question at the heart of everything tonight. There is an actual ancient text called the Book of Thoth, not the New Age mystical version that gets quoted in spiritual circles online, an actual scholarly, published ancient Egyptian text, written almost entirely in the Demotic script, translated and analyzed by Johns Hopkins University's Near Eastern Studies Department, and published in a proper academic edition. This text is structured as a dialogue. A deity, referred to as he who praises knowledge, understood to be Thoth himself, speaks with a mortal seeker called he who loves knowledge. Together they discuss the scribal craft, sacred geography, the underworld, wisdom, prophecy, animal knowledge, and temple ritual. And within this dialogue, Thoth is called Thrice Great, a title that connects directly to his later Greek name, Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes, the Thrice Great. Scholars at Johns Hopkins specifically note that this connection between the ancient Egyptian Book of Thoth and the classical Hermetic tradition is one of the most intriguing open questions in the entire field. But there's also a mythological story attached to the Book of Thoth, separate from the actual text, and it tells a very specific story about what happens when a human being tries to access Thoth's hidden knowledge. A prince named Neferkaptah becomes obsessed with finding the actual Book of Thoth, a physical scroll hidden at the bottom of a river, guarded by magical serpents and divine creatures, that grants the reader the ability to understand the language of all living things and to resurrect the dead. Despite warnings from his wife, from priests, from every authority around him, he pursues it, overcomes the guardians, and reads the scroll. The consequence is total destruction. His wife dies. His son dies. He himself eventually dies. Thoth enacts a terrible vengeance, not because the man was wicked, but because he had overreached the boundary between human and divine knowledge, taken what was never meant for mortal hands. Stop and notice what that story is structurally identical to. In Genesis, a man and a woman take fruit from a tree that offers the knowledge of good and evil. They are explicitly warned not to eat it. They eat it anyway. The consequence is expulsion from paradise, mortality, suffering, and the loss of direct communion with God. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers descend and teach humanity knowledge it was never meant to possess. The consequences are catastrophic: violence, corruption, the near total destruction of humanity in a flood. Same architecture, a threshold between divine and human knowledge, a transgression, a catastrophic consequence. Preserved in three separate ancient traditions that had genuine historical contact with one another across the ancient Near East. Let's be specific about what Thoth was credited with teaching, because this is where the parallel with the Watchers becomes most concrete. In Egyptian tradition, Thoth invented writing. He invented mathematics. He invented astronomy, the calculation of celestial movements, the naming of stars, the construction of the calendar from lunar and solar cycles. He invented magic, what the Egyptians called Heka, the sacred science of using divine words and formulas to affect reality. He invented the measurement of time and the division of the year into 365 days. And he invented medicine, specifically the use of sacred words and ritual formulas in healing, the idea that the right knowledge, correctly applied, could restore life to the dead. Now read the list of what the Watchers teach in the Book of Enoch. Azazel teaches metallurgy and weapons. He teaches the cosmetic arts, beautifying with pigment, making ornaments. Other Watchers teach astronomy, the reading of star movements and their prophetic significance. They teach root cuttings, the use of herbs entangled with magical formulas. They teach divination, the reading of omens from natural phenomena. The categories are not identical, but the underlying logic is exactly the same in both traditions. There is knowledge that belongs to heaven, and beings who stand between heaven and earth decided to share it with humans who were not supposed to have it. The specific content varies. The moral framework, forbidden transmission, transgression, consequence, is structurally identical. And here is something specific and documented. In the Book of Enoch, one watcher is specifically credited with teaching humanity writing and the knowledge of signs. Enoch himself, the human figure at the center of the text, is described as a divine scribe, the keeper of heavenly records, the one who writes down the judgments of God and delivers messages between the divine realm and humanity. That is Thoth, not metaphorically. That is functionally the same figure, a divine or semi-divine scribe who stands between heaven and earth, keeps the cosmic records, and mediates divine knowledge to humanity, appearing in two separate ancient traditions with different names and different cultural clothing, but the same essential function. In our previous documentary on Metatron, we established that Enoch, the man who walked with God and was taken without dying, was transformed into the highest angel in heaven, given the title the Lesser Jahve, and became the divine scribe recording every deed of every person on earth. What we didn't cover in that video is the next link in the chain. Because Enoch as Metatron doesn't stand alone. He is part of a documented tradition, recognized by scholars, that connects him to a specific set of figures across multiple ancient cultures, who all perform the same function. Enoch, the divine scribe; Thoth, the divine scribe; Hermes, the divine messenger and keeper of wisdom; and a Mesopotamian figure called Enmeduranki, a legendary king whose name means Lord of the Bond of Heaven and Earth, credited in Sumerian tradition with being taken up to heaven, shown the secrets of the gods, and sent back to teach divination and sacred knowledge to humanity. These figures are not copies of each other. They are not simply borrowed wholesale from one culture by another. They represent something that appears to be a recurring pattern across the ancient world. The figure of the divine intermediary, the keeper of secret knowledge, the one who stands between what heaven knows and what humanity can receive. Whether that pattern represents a common human intuition about how knowledge works, that it comes from somewhere beyond ordinary human capacity and is transmitted through specific figures who have special access, or whether it represents a memory, distorted across cultures and centuries, of something real that happened in the deep past, is the question that doesn't get resolved tonight. But the chain is real. Enmeduranki in Sumer, Thoth in Egypt, Enoch in the Hebrew tradition, Hermes Trismegistus in the Greek synthesis, each one occupying the same structural position in his own tradition, each one associated with writing, wisdom, sacred knowledge, and the dangerous boundary between what belongs to God and what belongs to man. Now we arrive at the detail that almost nobody who tells this story ever mentions. And it's the most historically grounded, most specifically documented, most legitimately surprising piece of evidence in the entire connection between Thoth and the Hebrew tradition. His name was Artapanus of Alexandria. He was an Egyptian Jew who lived in either the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, roughly 200 to 300 years before Christ. He wrote a text called Concerning the Jews, of which fragments survive in quotation by later writers. And in this text, Artapanus identified Moses as the same person as Thoth Hermes, not as a loose metaphor, not as a vague spiritual connection. He explicitly equated them, based, according to his own account, on their shared roles as authors of sacred texts and creators of laws. Moses wrote the Torah. Thoth invented writing and authored sacred texts. Moses gave Israel its law. Thoth gave Egypt its divine formulas and ritual codes. For Artapanus, looking at both traditions from the position of an educated Alexandrian Jew steeped in both cultures, these were the same function performed by the same kind of figure, or possibly, in his view, the same literal figure. This is not a fringe claim invented by modern internet researchers. This is a documented position held by an ancient Jewish writer, preserved in historical quotation, studied by scholars of Second Temple Judaism, and cited in mainstream academic literature on the Hellenistic period. It matters because it tells us something important. The comparison between these traditions wasn't invented in the modern era to make a controversial YouTube video. It was already being made by educated people who lived inside both traditions simultaneously 2,000 years ago. Here we need to pause and be honest about where the documented evidence ends and where fringe speculation begins. Because this is exactly the distinction that separates serious content from the kind of sensationalism we've been deliberately avoiding on this channel. The Emerald Tablet is one of the most famous documents in Western occultism. It contains the phrase that became the foundation of Hermetic philosophy, "As above, so below." It's attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the Greek-Egyptian synthesis of Thoth and Hermes, and in occult and New Age circles, it's presented as an ancient document of extraordinary significance, sometimes claimed to be literally written on an emerald tablet by Thoth himself. Here is the honest reality. The Emerald Tablet is not ancient. The earliest known Arabic version dates to the 6th or 7th century CE, well into the medieval period. It's a medieval alchemical text that borrowed the prestige of the ancient Hermes Trismegistus tradition to give itself authority. It has nothing to do with ancient Egypt in any direct sense. Similarly, the so-called Emerald Tablets of Thoth that circulate online, a long mystical text in which Thoth claims to be an Atlantean sage who flew to Egypt when Atlantis sank, are a 20th century invention, written by an American author named Doriel in the 1930s. They have no ancient provenance whatsoever. The reason this matters: if you want to make a serious, sourced argument about the connection between Thoth and the Watcher tradition, you have to be very clear about what the actual ancient evidence shows and what is medieval or modern layering on top of it. The ancient evidence, the Egyptian texts, the Book of Enoch, the Artapanus identification of Thoth with Moses, the scholarly chain from Enmeduranki through Thoth, through Enoch, through Hermes Trismegistus, that evidence is real and defensible. The Emerald Tablets are not part of it. The Atlantis narrative is not part of it. Let's go back to the ancient material, because there's one more piece of Egyptian evidence that belongs in this story and rarely gets discussed. In ancient Egypt, attached to major temples, there were scriptoria called the House of Life. These were not simply libraries in the modern sense. They were sacred institutions where priestly scribes copied, preserved, and studied the most secret religious and magical texts in Egyptian tradition. Access was restricted. The knowledge housed there was considered dangerous in untrained hands, and many of the texts in these libraries were attributed to Thoth, understood as texts of divine origin, preserved by humans but ultimately authored by the god of sacred knowledge himself. The actual ancient Book of Thoth, the academic text published by Johns Hopkins, is believed to be a product of exactly these houses of life. Written by temple scribes, structured as a dialogue between divine wisdom and human seeking, covering the full range of sacred knowledge from scribal craft to the underworld. The parallel to how the Book of Enoch describes its own origins is striking. Enoch, in the text, is not simply a man who wrote things down. He is explicitly shown the heavenly tablets, the divine record of all things, and his role is to translate that heavenly knowledge into a form that humans can receive and preserve. The text presents itself as, in some sense, heaven's own record, transmitted through a human intermediary. Thoth's texts present themselves the same way: divine in origin, preserved in restricted sacred spaces, dangerous in the wrong hands, transformative, potentially redemptive, potentially catastrophic, in the right ones. We've now laid out a substantial body of evidence. Before the conclusion, it's important to be precise about what it actually establishes, what is clearly documented and defensible. Thoth and Azazel both occupy the role of divine teacher of forbidden knowledge, one in the Egyptian tradition, one in the Hebrew apocalyptic tradition. The categories of knowledge they teach overlap significantly: astronomy, magic, sacred writing, divination. The moral framework in both traditions is identical. This knowledge was not meant for humanity. Its transmission was a transgression, and the consequences were catastrophic. The figure of the divine scribe, keeper of heavenly records, mediator between divine and human knowledge, appears independently across Sumer, Egypt, and ancient Israel, in figures that are structurally identical even when their names and specific details differ. And an ancient Jewish writer explicitly identified Thoth with Moses, demonstrating that this comparison was being made by educated insiders 2,000 years ago, not by modern internet researchers. What is genuinely uncertain: whether these parallel traditions represent actual historical transmission, Egypt influencing the Enoch tradition, or both drawing from a common older source, or whether they represent independent parallel developments in cultures that were asking the same fundamental question about where forbidden knowledge comes from. The influence of Egyptian culture on ancient Israel is extensively documented and generally agreed upon by scholars. But the specific mechanism by which Thoth's characteristics might have influenced the Watcher tradition in Enoch is not established. It could be direct borrowing. It could be a shared inheritance from an even older common tradition. It could be independent parallel development from similar human experiences and intuitions. The evidence establishes the structural parallel with confidence. It does not establish the mechanism of connection with certainty. There's a final chapter in this story that takes place after the ancient period, the synthesis that Greek culture created when it encountered Egypt, and what that synthesis tells us about how educated people in the ancient world understood these connections. When the Greeks arrived in Egypt following Alexander's conquests in the 4th century BCE, they encountered Thoth and recognized something in him that resonated with their own god, Hermes, divine messenger, mediator, guide of souls, keeper of wisdom. They identified the two gods with each other and called the combined figure Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, echoing the ancient Egyptian title from the Book of Thoth. Around this synthesis grew a body of philosophical and mystical literature, the Hermetic Corpus, that blended Egyptian sacred knowledge with Greek philosophical thought, and which had significant influence on early Christian theology, on Jewish mysticism, and ultimately on the intellectual traditions of the Renaissance and beyond. What's significant for our purposes is this: the Hermetic tradition explicitly understood Hermes Trismegistus as the same figure as both Thoth and Enoch. The chain we've been tracing tonight, Thoth, Enoch, Metatron, the divine scribe who stands between heaven and earth, was already a recognized chain in ancient and late antique thought. The Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus, writing in the 3rd century CE, described Hermes Trismegistus as the patron of all sacred knowledge, the figure through whom divine wisdom had been transmitted to humanity across all cultures and all ages. He didn't see Greek, Egyptian, and Hebrew traditions as separate systems pointing to unrelated truths. He saw them as different windows onto the same reality, different cultural expressions of a single, underlying divine knowledge that had been transmitted to humanity by a single, underlying divine figure who wore different names in different traditions. Whether that synthesis was right is another question entirely, but it tells us something important. The people closest in time to these traditions, educated in multiple ancient languages and multiple ancient traditions simultaneously, looked at exactly the same material we've been examining tonight and drew essentially the same conclusion. As always on this channel, we close by being honest about both sides. Why the core parallel is well-founded. The structural similarities between Thoth and the Watchers are real and specific, not vague thematic echoes, but precise functional parallels across the categories of knowledge transmitted, the transgression involved, and the consequences that follow. The ancient world was deeply interconnected. Egyptian culture influenced Canaanite culture. Canaanite culture influenced early Israel, and Egypt itself was a constant presence in Israelite history, from the Genesis narratives through the Exodus story and beyond. The identification of Thoth with Moses by Artapanus is a documented, peer-reviewed, academically studied fact, not a modern invention. And the chain from Enmeduranki through Thoth, through Enoch, through Hermes Trismegistus is recognized by mainstream scholars of comparative religion as a real, documented tradition of the divine intermediary figure across ancient cultures. Why the interpretation should be held carefully. Structural similarity is not proof of direct borrowing. Parallel stories about the boundary between divine and human knowledge appear across cultures with no historical contact. This might be a pattern that emerges independently wherever humans try to explain why civilization brings both progress and suffering simultaneously. The specific mechanism connecting Egyptian Thoth to the Hebrew Watcher tradition is not established. We can show the parallel, but we can't show the pipeline. And the later traditions, especially the Hermetic synthesis, were doing deliberate, conscious work to connect these figures, which means some of the apparent connections we see might be the product of that later synthesis rather than an original ancient relationship. We began tonight with two images. An ibis-headed god in an Egyptian temple, reed stylus in hand, recording the secrets of heaven. And a group of angels on a mountain in the Book of Enoch, making an oath to descend to earth and share what they knew with a humanity that was never supposed to have it. We've followed the thread through 3,000 years of Egyptian religious history, through the apocalyptic tradition of the Book of Enoch, through a Mesopotamian king who was taken to heaven and given the tablets of the gods, through an ancient Jewish writer who looked at two traditions and said, "These are the same person." And we've arrived, as we always do on this channel, not at a clean answer, but at a more honest question. If the same figure, the divine teacher, the forbidden transmitter, the keeper of heavenly secrets who chose to share them, appears across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and ancient Israel, wearing different names and different faces, but performing the same function and generating the same catastrophic consequence. What was being remembered? Was it a theological pattern that human minds independently discover when they try to explain where sacred knowledge comes from? Was it cultural transmission, one tradition borrowing the shape of another's myth and filling it with new names? Or was it something older, something that happened once and echoed through every tradition that came afterward? The way a stone dropped in still water sends rings outward in every direction simultaneously. The ground under these three traditions is ancient. The texts are real. The parallel is documented. What it means is still yours to decide.